Head of Data and Analytics Engineering, Supply Chain. Cool. All right. Welcome to episode 16 of Data Mesh TV. Today I am joined by my friend Nachiket Mehta. He is the Head of Data and Analytics Engineering at Wayfair for Supply Chain. So today's episode, we're going to try to do somewhat of a look back, right? Fortunately, we have the ability to take feedback and input and to observe a number of very successful data mesh implementations. Certainly we've all had challenges along the way. But if we think back about what's worked and what hasn't worked for all the data meshes around the world, and certainly have not seen them all, but I think it's been fantastic with the community, the data mesh community, how well we're sharing and how well we're learning from each other. If we take a look back, I want to try to look back on the different consumers. Oftentimes in early data mesh discussions, we're talking about the technologies and fantastic. We're talking about the processes. And we're also talking about the personas. Who is going to be affected by the data mesh? What is their role going to be in the new data mesh? And how do you kind of bring those personas along? And so I want to focus today's conversation on three personas. I want to think about the data producer. I want to talk about the data engineer, and I want to talk about the data consumer. And so Nachiket is perfect to have this conversation, not only with his experiences at Wayfair, but also because of what he has seen with his own colleagues and his own observations with other data meshes. So let's jump right into it. Welcome to the show, Nachiket.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Hey, those are sharp glasses. I really like them. I struggle to find glasses. If anybody wants to go back and watch episode 1, I had my glasses, and I just think I thought I looked sharp. But then when I went back and watched it, I realized that was mostly eyebrow, and so it's hard to cover these eyebrows. But if we try to bring the lens conversation back into a data mesh, what would be the analogy? Let's see. I think you had mentioned you had LASIK surgery recently or sometime in the past, right? I think you don't have to be a LASIK surgeon to give people clarity, to give people a better lens on their data, right? So what we're trying to do with data is like what a LASIK surgeon does with the lens of an eye. We do it much simpler. I don't know if that works or not, but there's my, I'll give you a shot. What's your best approach on the lens analogy for data?
I like it. Yeah, no, you're right. I got the LASIK done back in 2011. That's where I started. I was like 4 to 5 years in my career in the data space, and that's where the big data evolution began. But yeah, I think the analogy, I know you're looking for analogy. I don't have prescription glasses. I wear it to protect my eyes from the blue light. But there's a lot of data everywhere, right? And in order to get the sense, insights, and actions out of data, I wear glasses sometimes. Hopefully those lenses help me see sharp or plus better.
Awesome. Fantastic. Let's jump right into it. And you heard the opening. And so let me just kind of set the stage, and we'll kind of get started with maybe dissecting the first persona. But to set the stage, this is about design considerations. We're starting a brand new data mesh, or maybe there are organizations that have just started. They started with the technology layer, and now they're really trying to understand how to better affect the personas. I think more and more what I'm seeing, and I saw this yesterday, can't talk about it, but I saw an awesome data mesh design with a customer in New York. And I love their approach because they're focused purely on the consumer. Everything for their design is starting with the consumer. And it's a long list of consumers for them, but they're trying to drive a certain level of consistency. And I'm seeing that more and more. I contrast that to maybe what we were doing a year ago, where I think we were starting with the architect, right? Or we were starting with the engineer. And so I think I would love to say it's better to start with the consumer, but the reality is everybody has to start with what makes the most sense for them. Design considerations for your mesh, you have to consider all three. Where do you start? And so let's start with that conversation. Where did you start? Naturally, with the data mesh you kind of developed that Wayfair. Where was your starting point? Was it the consumer, the engineer, or did you start in the back end with the architect? The data producer. Maybe I should say not architect, more so data producer.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think you don't start with one instance in particular. I know this is a technology problem, or as they say, it's a socio-technical problem, right? It's not just the technology, but like there is this culture change involved in that as well. Business, what value you are adding to business based on the data and the insights, that ultimately matters the most. So in fact, in our journey, we started with the consumers first. There were instances in our organization where our organization grew pretty fast. So let me give you a quick overview of where we stand today and then kind of get back to your question. But we are like 15, 20 years old company. We started in data, the dot-com boom, with 200 smaller websites created by our founders to support a lot of this home good needs. Today, we are like 22 million active customers, about 25 million products being sold on our marketplace from 23,000 plus suppliers, right? And we have about 3,000 plus engineers and a lot of applications built in-house in our platform, right? So within like this short journey, we have grown a lot, but as part of that growth, there was data and the insights needed by the business users to make certain decisions, and they did not have all the insights accurately presented. But they get the best available data because they did not have time and energy to build into the data platforms and have thought process to do it right way, right? That worked fine when we grew to 10, 12, $13 billion company today, but this cannot scale when we go to $50 billion company or $100 billion company, right? So that's where our data mesh journey had started a few years back. Precisely, I joined Wayfair 4 years ago. And right after that, we started this end-to-end visibility initiative, which was blessed by our chief supply chain data officer at that time within my domain. And then even our new COO joined. He is our primary sponsor and a supporter of a lot of this data-driven insights and modern work that we are doing to support. And then that's where it started there. That's the most powerful and impactful thing that you need to have this large initiative kind of kicked off. And then the conversation with the data producers and to build the right data platforms became much easier. Obviously, not much easier, I would say. Let me say, there's a lot of challenges we had to go through to explain why we need to get there. But at least like that has been a strong foothold. It's been 3 to 4 years. We are still completely not there yet. Like if you break this into like 3 phases of like just getting bootstrapped done with like smaller POC, scaling it further, and then now sustaining that thing. We are not still in the sustainable mode. We are still scaling, but a lot of wounds and a lot of lessons learned along the way. So I'm happy to talk more about it.
No, fantastic. I want to underscore something, because in your approach, what we're talking about and what you're, one of the things that jumped out at me was the fact that you had full enterprise commitment, right? You had commitment from the top, I think the very top, if you will, to drive this data mesh strategy across the organization. And you also said, no, actually, Adrian, we didn't focus on one, we focused on all. And I think when you have that commitment from the top, I feel like it's easier to address all the personas, because in one respect, the personas are hearing the same message and you're hearing. They know that it's coming from the top and they have to play, so to speak. If you are not in that situation, oftentimes we work with organizations where they're not ready to really commit to it at the top, but they've got a couple of teams, smaller teams, lines of businesses that are fully committed. They want to go, they want to run. And oftentimes those teams are consumers. And so we start with them because they're the ones that are really pushing to kind of get the strategy going. And so they don't have that top level commitment, but they've got that line of business level commitment or that consumer commitment. And the challenge in that approach is that then you've got to go convince the producers and you've got to go convince the engineers to play along. And so it's a different type of sales pitch. Who did you, in your approach, because you went across the board, so to speak, you balanced the 3 personas. I don't know if you are comfortable talking about it, but which one of those was the most challenging without saying any names? Which one of those was it you struggle with the most?
I think there were challenges in all 3 to a certain extent, but the most challenging one continues to be the data producers, and not because of the organizational alignment or anything as such, just because of the sheer technical investment that was made in a fast-growing company where a lot of practices were not followed as best practices for a true marketplace, a technology organization is supposed to do, right? It started as an e-commerce, now transforming into the true technology company, like one of the tech companies out there. So that's where I think the challenges were. A lot of data producers built the solutions that were more monolith, more tightly coupled. And even though we got the alignment from certain leaders, like at that time, our CTO at that time started this data velocity initiative to kind of support our business executives and their initiatives. But there were challenges, more underlying challenges within the data producers and their systems, where we had to transform them from monolith to be more decoupled, more distributed, and more event-driven architecture, right? Like, so there's also a personnel issue where we had a lot of junior engineers in those organizations who did not know. This was probably their first or second job where they haven't built something big like that, right? And they grew with Wayfair's growth in the top, right? So that transformation took time, where we hired more senior leaders from outside who understood what it takes to really build this scalable, event-driven, more distributed platform. So I think that took its own time, and that added to the challenges that we faced. How we helped from our side was we came up with this vision, right? So I put together this vision and our overall end state architecture, saying, okay, this is what the end-to-end vision and the strategy, the technical strategy should look like. Ideally, we want to give the power in the hands of data producers to treat that data as a product, and what it takes to treat data as a product, what comes with the data product guarantees, all that usual stuff that data mesh principles talks about. But how do you enable that, right? Like, we have to prescribe things, right? So one of the things that we started was we established supply chain data ontology, right? Ontology plays a crucial role in this, right? Like a knowledge graph and who owns what, right? So we created this tuple of, hey, this is a domain, this noun and verb as a tuple of ontology that like identified the domains to drive the domain-driven ownership, the noun or the entities that the domains are associated or the entities are associated to, and the verbs define that these are the operational events that are happening on the ground, and these are the systematic or application events that needs to be generated to associate what's happening on the ground in a decoupled, more distributed architecture, right? So that journey, that white paper, a lot of documentation, and then enabling that through our data platforms took time.
Right. Wow, there's a lot of, there's like so much I want to unpack there, but I want to start with supply chain. This is fascinating because so supply chain, you work in supply chain. It's the way that it's the way your business operates, supply chain. But it feels like you've taken supply chain concepts, which are critical to efficiency, which are critical to speed, which are critical to kind of keeping every persona, if you will, in that supply chain happy and focused on what they need to do. You've taken those concepts and you've applied them to data mesh, which is really important, right? You talk about creating a supply chain ontology for the way that data is produced end to end, and it was probably easy for you because that's what you do. It's just normal supply chain approach. But I think for a lot of organizations, that's not easy. That's thinking about that data production from the production point to the consumer or serving point. That supply chain is not often creating that ontology. It's hard. But for you, I think it was easier because it was a normal, you couldn't think of any other way to do it because, again, you're a supply chain expert. So I love that. I also want to kind of just step back for a second. And as you were talking, I was thinking, gosh, there's so many different ways for us to think about these different personas. I think the producer one, I feel like it's the one, like, so who's a data producer? Well, okay, there's probably a lot of different folks that kind of sit in that camp, right? We're talking about if the business is on the far right, your data producer is on the far left. And somebody might say, well, there are people on the back end that are actually producing the data, right? Maybe there's application owners, maybe there's data owners that are responsible for how data is managed and responsible for making sure the data is correct, that the right quality is set for the data and right metadata is tied to the right data, so to speak. And so there's a data owner. Somebody else might say, well, there's also an architect there who's accountable for making sure that we're storing data in the right place, that the tools and systems that we're using to produce the data are reliable and that are secure. And so maybe they're in that camp as well. So I think that producer camp there's a lot of different people that work there. And then we think about the engineering camp. Well, to me, that's transformation, right? And to me, that's the easiest one to understand. To me, it's people that are driving transformation. And then we think about the consumer camp. Now you're talking about business analysts and IT analysts, right? There's all kinds of people, data scientists and MBAs that don't know anything about data science, right? There's a full spread of different skills and types of people that are consuming data for different purposes. Maybe they're building a dashboard, maybe they're driving an ML engine. So there are a lot of people that kind of fit these persona boxes. I think we're simplifying it by talking about three, but the reality is, first of all, every organization might name them differently, but more importantly, we're not talking about three people. We're talking about three big activities that are delivered by a lot of these people. And so you were talking about roles and accountabilities across the supply chain. I mean, let me ask some questions, right? What does your domain look like, Nachiket? If you think about a domain, obviously every domain is different. Who are the people involved in that domain?
Yeah, good question. So I know you mentioned it was easy. I want to clarify that it was not easy.
You made it sound easy.
For the supply chain ontology piece, I mean, because we traditionally believed in building a lot of applications in-house instead of like leveraging the custom-made solution, because we were building a very unique platform and connecting suppliers and customers using a lot of proprietary technologies. And as part of that fast growth, a lot of decisions, those ontology was absent, and a lot of applications did not consider beyond their application how somebody would connect their application with the next application, right? Like a warehouse management system to a transportation system, working with the delivery system, working with the return. So a lot of those pieces were missing in a way. But that's where I think ontology is helpful, where we leverage more industry standard best practices, right? And then we kind of leverage that. And the good news is that we established that as the first within Wayfair, and now there are other domains within Wayfair who are also exploring and establishing this ontology concept. So now across multiple domains, you are talking with the source of truth for that domain. So that's where domain-driven ownership of the data mesh principles comes in. So that's an area. So getting to your question on who are all those actors or personas within our domain, right? But that remains consistent across the domains, because now we are talking personas, right? So there's data producers, data consumers, and data engineers or data platform engineers, I would rather say. And I can associate that with like lenses, right? There's a technical lens, there is business lens, and there is ethical lens, right? Like treating data as a product and managing it securely with the good governance, federated governance, and all that good principles. One other thing I want to add before I go into double click into the details is we are in a shared economy in general, like not beyond data mesh. If you think about it, now we are sharing apartments, we are sharing cars, we are sharing clothes, we are sharing bikes, like, right? So likewise, data, it's shared. Like it's not clearly identified boundaries of data producers and data consumers. In fact, many data producers are also data consumers, right? So if I say data producers are your software engineers, your application engineers, your data consumers starts with data engineers, your data scientists, ML engineers, business analysts, BI engineers. But then those data consumer group are also data producers, because they are taking some data product, adding some more value on top of it, or maybe taking multiple data products, adding further value on top of it. And now they are the data producers, because the new data product they have created is now consumed by somebody else, right? Maybe business executives or other domains outside of supply chain. So we are in that shared economy, even in the data space, I would say. And then the data engineers are your infrastructure engineers, your platform engineers, right? They are really building the self-service data platforms as part of the data mesh principle to ensure that we treat data as a product, like what it means, right? Data has to be discoverable, addressable. Data contracts should be there. But how do you enforce the data contracts? Or before enforcing, how do you capture the data contract? Where do you document the data contract? That data contract needs to be monitored constantly. And if violation happens, what sort of alerting needs to be sent back to the data producers so that they can proactively work on it, right? So a lot of those factors go into the data platform, the self-service data platform, as we call it. Uh, and then lineage, data observability, cataloging, a lot of those information, the layers, they are part of the data platform. They are very meaningful, right? Like you may not build everything. Now there are, like, as part of the modern data stack, a lot of tools are available. They are doing it much better job. So you can leverage that. But that's the whole area where the data platform piece may not be just your internal actors. You may now introduce more external actors, other vendors into this mix to offer that data platform.
Wow. Yeah. Let me underscore something else you said there that I wrote down. You talked about these end-to-end data contracts and the importance of them. I love the concept. Whenever I talk data contracts with different people, we don't have time for the show, but I'm just going to say they mean different things to different people. And many years ago, before data mesh existed, we would talk about data contracts a certain way, and I think that definition has evolved. So I don't want to get into that in the discussion. I think at a high level, what we're talking about is agreements from the producers to the transformation engineers, kind of in the middle, to the consumers on the end. And that agreement outlines responsibilities. That agreement defines handover points. That agreement also possibly starts to provide authority. And so maybe a data owner on the producer side is granting some authority to a domain owner. And they're saying, I am going to allow you or give you the authority to make decisions on how my data is accessed. Fantastic, because that means now for anybody in the domain, everyone's familiar with this, the idea of having to go find a data owner to get permission. Now you've given an entitlement, if you will, to a domain owner to make those decisions. That's a great contract agreement. So really, really like the concept of a data contract. And I think maybe you should write an article on that, because I think there's not that end-to-end view isn't written well enough yet.
Yeah, you're right. Know in a traditional data engineering, big data warehousing space, right? Like where the data comes in many different forms, right? And it doesn't have to be real time. And there are data contracts established in a traditional way as in forms of schema or a flat file contracts or some functions, Lambda functions that kind of monitors. But in here, I mean, data producers should own the data contract, right? We are talking about pull model instead of push model in data mesh, right? And then where they are kind of saying, this is my data product, I'm enforcing this as a data producer, and I will associate these guarantees with that. There are those data contracts has to be automated as part of their CI/CD pipelines, right? If the data is in motion, then it has to have a schema, is Avro or Protobuf, and that's where you identified all your schema level guarantees, the metadata, the semantics of it, and all. If the data is at rest, don't couple it with your database behind the scene, like maybe put some GraphQL API layer or REST API layer or something to kind of decouple that, and then that kind of creates this contract enforcement, right? Now you have, or YAML file configuration, right? You can establish the contract, and then that's where you are enforcing and building the tools as part of your self-service data platform to enforce them, to monitor them first. And then if the violation happens, then send them Slack alerts, send them alerts via PagerDuty or Datadog or whatnot, and maybe create a Jira ticket to kind of back to the data producer saying, hey, this violated the data contract, it needs to be fixed, right? So that whole circle, the 360 loop, feedback loop becomes much more efficient as part of
it. This topic always dominates the conversation. And while I'm saying, let me move on, I got to ask one more question about data contracts. Just things. First of all, thank you. You're sharing a lot, and you're giving a lot of great ideas, I think, out to the audience on not only how you do it, but how others can kind of model their approach. And so fantastic content. Going back to data contracts, let me ask more of a process question. I like to advise customers. I tell them agility right now for a lot of organizations is the most important thing. Ideation, innovation, kind of fostering, empowering people to invent is the most important thing. We talk about trying to drive a competitive business. Having very stable data products, while useful and helpful for parts of the organization, may not be what other parts of the organization need. So data contracts, I would say, I think in some parts of the company, the rigidity, if you will, they need to be strong, stable, do not change data contracts, right? They follow the process all the time, every time. in a different part of the organization, maybe where we're doing invention, where we need to ideate, where I work with a customer where they create 100 data products in a day, right? And 90 of them are wrong, 10 of them are good, right? But the idea is, what if I do this? No, what if I do this? No, what if I do this? And so they're sitting there using federated queries or whatever they want to do to kind of create these data products because they want to drive innovation. So the data contract in that team looks a lot different than the data contract for maybe a risk management team or a finance team. What do you think of that? Does that make sense? Would you agree with that approach, or do you think it's important to have a consistent data contract across all the teams?
I do. I think like the example that you gave, in my mind, that's not a data product. If you are doing experimentation of those 100 different, they could be models, they could be data sets, data assets. So I would give them these different names, but not as a data product, because data product to me is owned, guaranteed, comes with the SLOs and SLIs. And that is something that is consumed by many users in the production capacity to add some value to the business, right? It sounded, and I may be wrong based on what you said, based on just like that one or two sentences, but it sounded like that persona, the actors are doing a lot of experimentations of those 100 so-called data products, but in my mind, more data assets or experiments before coming to this 10 more curated data sets that say, yeah, this is what I need to make the change to the business, right? And I think that's what I would rather call data products, and not those remaining 90 that are more part of their internal experimentation, right? There's a concept of internal data or external data, or rather public and private data, right? So anything that's private within your domain, it's fine. It's running your domain, running your applications and all that. But the moment where you create a mesh architecture and where you have to kind of share your data product as a source of truth for a lot of other consumers to consume, that's what I would rather call it data.
Got it. So as a hard rule, you would say, and I mean, I'm asking, as a hard rule, it sounds like you would say every data product would have some type of service level agreement or expectation with it. When we publish data product, the consumer has these minimum expectations every time. You mentioned a couple of, service level. What you said SLI and SL something. But you would say every one of your products you create, by default, they have to have that expectation.
That is correct. Yeah. Just think about like any other product, consumer products or software products we use, right? If we are given access as a consumer, we are given access to a product. And if while we are using it, a lot of changes are made that are more experimental in their development or testing environment, we lose trust in that product, right? So that's what I meant, where the product has to be stable, bring value. A lot of other things can happen behind the scene as an internal part of that product evolution, but then it has to have versioning, right? If you are really adding some better value, add further version of those products and make it available in a proper release format, along with the guarantees that comes with it, right? And service level objectives and
awesome. Well, let's stay out together on the screen we'll close out the session together, and so because I'm going to try to summarize. I'm going to start with the consumer and work my way left to the producer, and I'm going to see if my summary, if you agree, if you want to add to it. So we'll start with the consumer, and then the approach I'll take is why this is beneficial, what the positive impact of the consumer is, and then I'll also maybe make a point or two about things to be careful with the consumer, right? So let's see if I can, or with every one of the personas, let's see how I do. So let's start with the consumer. I think why the data mesh, or why this approach is beneficial for the consumers, because we are offering, I don't think we said this enough today, but to me, the big benefit is self-service, right? We're enabling them to go out and do more work on their own. I always say, if you want to drive fast, give them the keys. But giving the business teams the key to do more with their data. And so that's a big benefit to me for that consumer. I said there are different kinds of consumers, and some consumers are more focused on ideation and innovation, and some consumers are more focused on stable, reliable, kind of less change, if you will, data products. And then you said, yeah, it's true, but there should still be a level of expectation. You don't want anybody out there building data products just throwing them in the air, because then it's going to erode confidence. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Great. Good job with that part.
Right. Yeah. So, and we are talking about user enablement, right? Like, which is a key aspect to make sure that data is accessible, understandable, and usable. right? And that everyone needs to understand as part of the data mesh architecture. Those are key lenses for the user.
Absolutely. And we didn't talk enough about the engineer. I think we were so, and rightfully so. I jumped to the consumer, and I started with the consumer again here. But in the center part with these data engineers that are doing a lot of the transformation work, I think the benefit to them, I think first and foremost, I would say we're offering them the opportunity to sit back and just take a deep breath. That function is overwhelmed in a lot of companies. There aren't enough of them around the world to kind of put to work. And two, as soon as you put them to work, they're overwhelmed. The demand from the consumer side, especially when they don't have self-service tools available, for them to do all the transformation on their own is really difficult. And then when we're asking them to do the kind of transformation you're talking about, what I mean by that is not only do we want you to create new data models, but oh, by the way, these data models have to meet these service level agreements. Wow, that's a lot to ask. And so for me, I think when we start talking about data contracts and we start thinking about data lineage end to end, and we start thinking about sharing responsibilities with the consumer, for the data engineer, I think what we're actually doing is we're actually, in some senses, although they would probably disagree with me, we're making life a little easier. A data engineer would say life never gets easy. There's always more work to do, but we're making life easier because we're sharing some of those responsibilities with the consumer. We're making their life easier because we're creating, I love your supply chain concept, right? We're creating agreements for how data needs to be handled across the supply chain. So it shouldn't be as chaotic now. It should be repeatable. There should be certain expectations, so to speak. The data you're getting should be better because of the contract you develop in the back end. And then the consumer you're serving now, there's expectations that they should not only expect, but more importantly, they're not asking for more, right? Like, this is what we do, it's how we do it, boom, so to speak. And so there's a good handoff between the engineer and the consumer. I don't feel like I've said enough. What else could we say about that engineer from a benefit perspective?
Yeah, no, I think you are right.
Yeah.
That is it's growing demand to solve that problem, right? Like, consumers are growing, their demand to use the data are growing. Producers needs to kind of abide this data product construct. But those engineers, the data engineers or platform engineers sitting in the middle, have to apply transformation for both of these actors and still kind of do that in a self-service manner where they are not part of the equation for a long time, to again tightly couple them in this overall equation of a mesh, right? I think they have to build the right platform, not products. Data producers focus on building the products, the data products, and consumers are the domain owners who are leveraging the data products and the data platform to make decisions for business, right? And really driving the value for business, because ultimately that's where the total cost of ownership and the ROI equations are calculated and budgeted from executives, right? They need to see the value that all this entire initiative across different teams are adding.
Awesome. And then just to kind of close up the engineer, and then we'll close up the producer. The last thing I'll say about that engineer, I think, is something to think about maybe for another show, is that more and more, I think, in a data mesh, as you mature, that consumer, because you're giving them self-service tools, that consumer maybe in 5 years or maybe faster will start to do some of the things the engineering team used to do, because they're able to create their own data products, because they're able to do more of their own work. And so I think some of those capabilities start to kind of in a positive way, start to be available to that consumer. And I'm going to run out of time, but if I go back to the data producers on the back end, to me, I think the win for them is very similar to the engineers in the sense that we're sharing responsibilities. I love being able to sit in front of a data owner who has been struggling with metadata, because to be fair, they're not the ones using the data. They don't understand that, oftentimes, not everywhere, but many times they don't understand the business processes or the business problems that the data is being used to solve. And so when we go to them and say, hey, the metadata is wrong, or we go to them and say, fix all the quality, we're asking way too much. When we talk to a data owner and we walk them through that lineage and we help them understand how the data is being used in different domains, and we tell them, oh, and by the way, these domain teams, they're going to share the responsibility for metadata. These domain teams, they're going to share the responsibility for quality. They're going to tell you which data sets are the most important for you to fix first. They're going to tell you where the metadata is missing. They're going to help you understand how the data is used. For me, I think what we're doing for that producer is we're bringing them into the fold. We're allowing them to really understand how data is being used more so than ever before. And we're making their job achievable because it's not all on their shoulders anymore. So that's my speech for the data producer. Yeah. What did I miss?
Yeah, you're right. I think the simplified way, like this data mesh construct, would be really adopted well if all data producers will have a full visibility on all their consumers down to a column level lineage if possible, right? So before dropping a column or before doing something, they know, oh, wait a minute, I cannot do it because that is being used in so and so reports or so and so models or by so and so applications, right? And likewise, data consumers needs to know where am I guiding this data from? Is this trusted? Is it rubber stamped by so and so team because I know that is the team or the domain owner? I think that plays a huge role in this, and that's where the the data engineers, data platform engineers plays a role in bringing that lineage, bringing that catalog, bringing that data quality scores and data observability to build that trust in the data product.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I got to go back and listen to the show now. So we're at the blog because there's so much in this show, just in terms of rich content. So I really thank you, Nachiket, for joining me, for being so helpful in the conversation. I look forward to doing this again with you, maybe in the future.
Yeah, my pleasure. This was great conversations. Would love to be again in future. Thank you, Adrian.
Awesome. Thank you.